Well, our next speaker now is Dr. Aaron Wolf, professor and water resources geographer in Oregon State's College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. He co-directs the, there we go. He co-directs the Water Conflict Management and Transformation Program, through which he has offered workshops, facilitations, and mediations around the world. The title of his talk is Conflict, Cooperation, and Transformation. Welcome, Dr. Wolf.
Thanks, and thanks, well, first of all, to those who put this together here in engineering, and of course the sponsors. And I appreciate John saying I'm not an academic. We know because he ended on time, right? So we know you're not. So I was struck, and I think these two hopefully complement each other. Well, I was struck by the 6 priorities that he put up. Only one of them was technical. I don't know if you saw that. One was about data. All the rest were about relationships, about planning, about. And so, and what I'm hoping to do now is bring the two together explicitly, right? The dean talked about what a great place OSU is for water, precisely because the walls are low. So just a quick survey. How many people here are on the kind of technical side of water, engineering, hydrology? Okay, School of Engineering, not surprised. How many people are on the other side of social science, political science? Absolutely none. Excellent. I can say whatever I want. How many people are none of those and they saw the free food and thought, oh, what a cool place to be? Okay, yep, own it. Excellent. Okay, so what in this kind introduction is mentioned that we have here at OSU a program in water conflict management, and it really is taking those two sides explicitly. We have part of the program is to count things, to understand things better, but part of it is to think about relationships. And so most of the work that or a lot of the work that we do is international, and this is kind of the problem writ large, is nature gives us watersheds, right? This is the kind of technical way to look at things. Everything's connected. Surface water, groundwater, quality, quantity, and then we draw those nice straight lines in the middle of them representing countries, some of whom don't like each other very much at all, right? So look at the Jordan Basin is in the news for a lot of reasons, the Nile Basin, Tigris, Euphrates. So we see, and other people have noticed, that this intersection of watersheds and tense boundaries is something to pay attention to. So around the early 90s, just about the time I started here, this was kind of the dominant paradigm, is we were going to go to war over water. The renewable resource most likely to stimulate interstate resource wars, river water. Kofi Annan, at the time DG of the UN, fierce competition for fresh water may well become a source of conflict and wars in the future, right? It's an easy argument to make. People share water, they hate each other, therefore they're going to go to war. How many people buy the argument? Yeah, all right. So let's take a closer look. A lot of us, especially those, my background originally is as a scientist, so we know how to count stuff. So what do we know? People are projecting war and peace. What's the actual evidence, right? So we started to ask this question, is it possible that water also leads to dialogue? As you start to look at those very tense basins, you start to hear about people also talking to each other across tense boundaries. So the question is, does water lead to peace or to conflict? And of course the answer is yes, right? Once you really start to look at the processes, what tends to happen, at least in the international community, is a kind of flow where a country, generally countries prefer to develop internally, right? There's less hassle, there's less politics, but at some point their development has impacts across the border. And at that point, there's going to be a flashpoint. That's where everybody gets excited, the news comes out, people are talking about wars, and then really quietly, they'll then spend 10 or 20 or 30 years negotiating until they come to a water agreement, right? So if we now start to look at what the evidence is, one, is it just those 6 basins? That's kind of the prevailing wisdom. That's not that big a problem. Well, it is. Shared basins are everywhere. Half the land surface of the Earth
There's 313 international basins. 40% of the world's population is in a shared basin. 60% of water flow comes out of basins shared by 2 or more countries. How far do we have to go from this spot to be in an international watershed? We're in one. We're in one, right? So the Willamette is a tributary of the Columbia, which I know our maps don't show it, but it has headwaters in another country, right? And our maps kind of end at the parallel there. So it's a big issue, right? Now, it doesn't bring conflict or cooperation. Again, when the conflict dynamic was kind of the prevailing wisdom, it was driven by kind of the post-Cold War, what are we going to do with all this defense money? Some of you may remember we were talking at the time about the peace dividend, right? Remember the peace dividend? We were going to spend a lot of money on education and on health care and on social services. It didn't work out that way. But at the time, the military was looking for what's their next strategy. What are they going to spend their budget on? And so they started to, and with actually some folks who were interested in climate change, started to look at, within this context of the post-Cold War, looking at data that would help predict conflicts and environmental conflicts in general as the next set of conflicts. And so this is where we really started to kind of hone in our center here. That graph on the top, that's now, I don't know, 20-something years old. That's probably the most published thing of mine that ever went out. All we did was count stuff, right? That's what scientists do. We looked at the last 60 years, at any time 2 countries did anything over water, and we asked what did they do? And we put it on a spectrum from very, very intense conflict to very, very intense cooperation. And what we got is this graph that suggests right off the bat there were 3,600 events. Out of those, 2/3 of the time we do anything over water, it's cooperate. That wasn't out there in the literature at all. Nobody was talking about cooperation. For some reason, neither press nor politicians seem interested in cooperation. And even on the conflict side, you see most of the conflict is at kind of -1, -2. That's people talking about conflict. Who talks about conflict? Which sectors? I gave you the hint. Who is it? The press and politicians, exactly right? We will go to war over the lifeblood of our nation, or the headline, I'll sit for hours with a journalist talking about cooperation and how cool it is and this magic elixir that brings us all together. Water wars on the horizon, always, always, always the headline, right? So that's what that is, an actual violence. There's very little across borders around water specifically. So there's only 30-something cases of minor violence. None of them exploded into war. In fact, the only war in history that was fought across international boundaries on water was 4,500 years ago between the city-states of Lagash and Umma, right? So we have a record, and these aren't people who like each other, right? This is, again, Israelis and Arabs, Indians and Pakistanis, Azeris and Armenians, even California and Oregon, right? We have addressed our water issues. So then what happened at that point, early 2000s, is the dialogue started to bifurcate. And the security people continued to kind of pitch the water wars scenario, probably a little bit because they were looking for a mission. And so the CIA got involved, military people from around the world got involved, where the conflict's going to be. And meanwhile, the water people started to ask the opposite question. We know that people who don't like each other share water. Is it possible to use that as an entryway for dialogue? Can we use the simple fact that we share such a critical resource be used to bring people together in dialogue? And that's kind of where we've been focusing. So a lot of the emphasis has been on early warning. Yeah, it turns out you actually can do early warning. The prevailing wisdom, conflicts are too complicated to monitor. Scarcity is the primary cause. And that's what kind of led to that simplistic thinking about wars. We're running out of something we need, therefore we'll fight over it. But if you think about the water that's critical, the water that you might fight over, what water are you thinking about? For which use? Drinking water, right? Well, you're not going to fight over drinking water because if you don't have it for 3 days, you're not in a condition to fight, right? Most of the world's water, and Oregon and California, goes to agriculture, right? So if you think about who makes the decisions to go to war and peace, it's not this diffuse group of people who are engaged in an activity that, while critical, doesn't contribute very much to GDP, right? So it turns out that actually we can think about early warning, and it turns out to be kind of simple. There's 2 sides to what's going on in the basin. There's all the changes. We talk about climate change and droughts and floods and quality and all these development, all the things that we think about that we think might be indicators. But then we have the institutional capacity that we develop to manage that variability, right? So we will never, ever go to war with Canada, even though we share water and even though the water is variable, because we have great institutions, great relationships, great treaties. If you take the same variability in a place without the institutions, without the treaties, without the River Basin Organization, it can trigger tension, right? So now we know all, quote, we have to do is monitor where people want to build stuff and see if there's an agreement in place for how to deal with the impacts of what they're planning to build, okay? This is the first map we did back in, 2008 on the left with the early warning which basins might lead to tension. And that's the UN's version. Anybody see the differences? Any cartographers here? Dorta, all of our colleagues from geography, they don't know how to cross the line over to engineering, I think. And what are the differences? Anybody see them? You guys didn't know it was going to be interactive, right? It's like, just play the damn video. Who sees something? The lower left and the center What are the differences? Yeah. The color scheme, right? That's the first one, right? So we did reds. This is the stoplight color scheme. The UN said, oh, no, that's too conflictive. We don't believe in conflict. So this is now called the grapevine color scheme. So we're using greens and, right, happy colors, right? How happy is it? So look at our title there, basins at risk, and that's their title, basins under observation, right? No conflict in the UN, right? So this is something now we try and do over in CEOS pretty regularly. We can monitor who's building stuff. We can evaluate whether they have good agreements, and then we can continue, as we have here in this heat map, doing some early warning. Just some examples, if you look at the Himalayas, so here are the areas with really bad agreements or no agreements at all. And here's where historic variability, but with climate change, you see the increase in variability is precisely where you don't have agreements in place, right? So looking at those 2 sides together is key. Looking at the change, looking at the capacity becomes important. Okay, water causes conflict and climate change will make it worse. One of the interesting things, there's a number of people who are looking also on climate change, looking at indicators of conflict, and what they never do is see whether those same things indicate cooperation. Because in water they do. In water, droughts tend to bring people together to deal with the droughts. Plumes of bad quality tend to bring people together to deal with these. All the things that we think indicate conflict in water also indicate cooperation. And so what I'm hoping is that in the climate change world, they also start to do the same thing. People are talking about climate change caused Syria to implode, climate change caused migration out of Chad. It's like, okay, but let's look. Is there a possibility that these same perturbations do bring people together as they do in water? So now that we have all this data and we've counted everything, where are we heading? I have no earthly idea. And I'll tell you this, 10 years ago, if you had told me that we were going to use buckets more energy to generate AI or to mine Bitcoin, or that we were going to build dams because somebody in a COP decided that that's clean energy, I wouldn't have predicted any of that stuff at all. People say on the technical side, secrecy is dead, right? And it's true. You can now monitor the level of a dam. You can tell how much groundwater is being pumped. You can tell an awful lot, but you can't tell what decision somebody's going to make tomorrow. You can measure the level of a dam, but you can't tell what their dam operations are going to be for the following growing season, right? For that, we still need better conversations earlier. And that's the critical juncture in all of this cooperative work, better conversations earlier, right? Issue's never the issue, right? Talk about water, it's never about water. These are not probably figures you were figuring you would see in this presentation or in this room even. But I want to shift direction, because this idea of thinking about both the technical, the things that we count, the rational, and also the emotional, the management, the conversations, the relationship, these are basically two aspects of knowledge that we've been dealing with together and in parallel for generations, for millennia, and only recently in kind of the post-Enlightenment world have we decided to separate those worlds out, right? The idea that you can everything that's going to drive decision-making is going to be from the rational side. If you can measure it, it can inform your decision-making. You can have this other community, your religious, your faith community, but it's private, your Friday, your Saturday, your Sunday community, and you don't let it influence policy, right? That's a relatively recent split that happened in a relatively specific geography, and it's not global. So those of us who work internationally or go internationally or engaged in cross-cultural dialogue know that so often what you see are people from the, quote, West having closed one eye 200 years ago and saying to the rest of the world, hey guys, this is a really cool way to see the world. You should do this too, right? Look at the perspective you see. And they're going, what are you talking about? If you look at all of our faith traditions, there is this idea that we have these two sides to us. We have the rational side, we have the spiritual side, but that they work not only in parallel, but they unite in our heart and our intuition. Okay? So this is true in Judaism, that's the Kabbalistic map of the universe, in Taoism, in Hinduism, in Christianity. And I threw a graph up there because I know a lot of you are feeling very uncomfortable right about now. So this is John Nash. This is basically his Nash equilibrium. That's the real guy and the fictional guy. But his Nash equilibrium is basically that. You know, people always said economics was individuals working in their self-interest. But what he said is no. We always think partly about our own individual interest and also partly about the group, right? That's what the Nash equilibrium is. And this is, again, what faith traditions have been saying for thousands of years. Why do I talk about any of this? Because in water, it's also true. When we sit down to negotiate water, we're not negotiating something that's only measurable, quantifiable, rational, right? We're measuring, in this framework, there's 4 waters, right? On the rational side, we have the physical water, the water that we touch, that we move, that has a physical component. We have mental water, the water that we calculate, the efficiencies, the crop per drop. But when you're sitting in negotiation, the conflict itself may well be about emotional water. Water tied to sovereignty, water tied to history, water tied to power relationships, water tied to representation. Or it may be spiritual water, water tied to one's faith community. Let me just quickly do a quick survey. How many of you in this room come from a faith tradition that uses water for spiritual transformation? Hands way up high. Everybody does. Even you guys who are afraid to raise your hands, you also come from a faith tradition that yes, you do. You can't shake your head. Everybody does. If you go back far enough, you do, right? And that's the point. By ignoring this, we're ignoring the single most uniting factor we have, and we can be explicit about it, right? How many of us have been in a tribal setting? What's the very first thing that happens when the tribe welcomes you to the land? It's a prayer. You're welcomed in prayer. We don't We don't flinch, right? We recognize that this is something that can elevate a conversation, that can unify us. Well, so we have in negotiations, we talk about the physical water and mental water, but the conflict itself may be rooted in mental or physical. So the argument is we need to remember how to unify the two sides of our being, okay? Why? One, it's more fun, right? If you look at, first of all, who's in the room, we're used to the practitioners, the policymakers, development partners. We hope academia is invited. Sometimes we are, sometimes not. We're remembering increasingly to invite the indigenous and spiritual community, private enterprise. All of them need to be in the room if we're going to have good decisions. And oftentimes, even just explicitly naming the fact that water has a spiritual component can help elevate a conversation, right? So if we had started this meeting with a prayer, it would have been super off-putting and divisive, right? But if we start a meeting about water with, for example, a rabbi, an imam, a priest, sounds like a joke, right? A rabbi, right? If you had started with each of them expressing how water is within their faith traditions, how it elevates, how it represents us holistically, it can elevate the conversation. Oftentimes, faith leaders can be facilitators. The Copts on the Nile were tapped into because they have relationships, they have representation both downstream Egypt and upstream Ethiopia. Science is depressing. We try and get people excited by scaring the crap out of them, right? So here's how we talk about the Columbia. Here's our Columbia. The climate change means that the hydrograph is getting earlier and higher and less snow, less melt. Fish are dying, fish are dying, fish are dying. This is how people experience water, right? Well, how do you unify this? How do you remind people that this is our relationship? River festivals is a really good way, right? We have them around, and those of us who have been to them, they're huge fun, right? There's a dancing catfish. Wouldn't you like to see a dancing catfish more than seeing a graph of a bunch of dead fish? This is fun, right? There used to be, anybody been to Stockholm Water Week? So there used to be a Stockholm Water Festival. It's like a global, it's like this, but global. And a lot of people come from all over the world. There used to be a festival that went along with it, and it got too rowdy. People got too excited, too drunk, too violent. And it's like, yeah, that's what you want if you're going to be celebrating water. So they shut down the festival, and now it's PowerPoints dawn till dusk, right? Right? You're in Stockholm like this, windowless room, no connection to the river, PowerPoints dawn till dusk. What if this meeting had been on a barge floating down the Willamette, right? Couldn't that have been interesting? Remembering to tap into the water art, to the water music. There's a Nile Project. These are musicians from the 11 countries up and down the Nile. And that's what they do. They go up and down the Nile playing their music that's inspired by their relationship to the river. So how do you do this practically? I just wanted to end with this quote. This comes right out of New Zealand's water management plan. And they worked hand in hand with the Maori community to again, reintegrate the worlds of rationality and spirituality. And this is how it starts off. All the things in the natural world have a life force, a spiritual dimension, respect for spiritual integrity of the environment, and God that created it will ensure that the treasure can be protected and passed on to succeeding generations. I think that's a nice place for us both to end this and also to go out and do our work. Thanks very much.
Does anybody have any questions?
We're speechless. Okay.
Thanks, Aaron. Are there some local issues that you've been working on here in Oregon, California, things like that?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I really like the previous presentation, and I just keep coming back to what the dean said about and you know about OSU being a good place for us to be. There's a basin south central, the Chihuacan, and it was kind of a classic what happens in Oregon or what happens throughout the West, right? So there's a little lake that dried up. It's a hypersaline lake, one of the few in the area, and it was critical for the Pacific flyway. So it dried up, and the environmentalists freaked out and went to Salem and said, "Hey, you know, lake's drying up, fish are dying, or birds are dying. You got to stop the ranchers from ranching," right? So the ranchers did what people do when they're threatened: is they organized, they got together, and instead of lawyering up and going to court, they called us and said, "Can you put us in touch with the environmentalists? We think we can come up with a better solution together than spending 10 years in court." And it was so powerful, and so we did. And fortunately, some of the environmentalists are here on campus as researchers and instructors. And so we started off just with a dinner and then a couple of dinners, and now there's a formal organization on the Chihuacan. I don't remember what it's called, PLAC. Partnership on Lake Abert and the Chihuacan. And they're, you know, we've been meeting now for a year, and OSU was tapped to do the joint fact-finding mission. So we're tasked with writing the document that everybody on the room can agree what's what before they start making future decisions. And the relationships are incredible. I mean, everybody's learning so much about each other. All the suspicions, all the preconceptions that both sides had about each other just out the window. And they're asking each other, "Hey, what if we tweak this? What if we did that?" And they recognize, I mean, I think both sides recognize just how much all of them care about that area, right? The ranchers, they're 7th generation, 8th generation, so they deeply care about sustainability, and they really like the fact that the birds fly back and forth every year. And so it's been a lovely thing. And yeah, I've worked throughout kind of Western U.S. on those kinds of issues. Thanks for asking.
Yes, thanks. Great talk. So you pointed out the spiritual aspects of water, and really, I think it seemed like you were getting at, like, you have to remember why water makes us happy, basically, right? Because I'm just wondering, in parts of the world that's becoming much more secular, is this a harder message to get across, or is it not so much religion per se, but just more joy and happiness and just, you know, that connectedness that you were talking about? Like, how have you approached different cultures, you know, as they have different religious tolerances and beliefs?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So interestingly, the least religious tolerance I've found is in the kind of secular post-Enlightenment West. And I don't find anti-religion. What I find is we're just not used to talking about it. It's not that long ago, right? It's not that long ago that all of our institutions of higher learning were within faith traditions. And that's true in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. This was the nature of the beast, right? Is that those components of us were integrated. And so my experience is, I mean, what nobody likes is having a faith tradition shoved down their throat or held up as an exemplar. And I don't do that. It's not my belief. And it's not something that I think is useful. What I think is useful is that kind of right side, the kind of combination of the emotional and the spiritual, is to just remind us that so much that we deal with, almost any issue, is not the issue is not the issue, right? So you think about the last conflict you had, right? Was it rational? Right? You're thinking, yeah, my side was, right? But it's not. We know it's not. And so we know intuitively that there are other aspects. What I think is useful for explicitly naming it is that right side has a lot of tools that are really useful in understanding, like the source of anger, dealing with conflict. These are things that faith traditions and thinking about the emotional side can do better than the secular. I've been in negotiations where they say, let's leave all the politics out of the room. You can't do that, right? It's all politics, right? And the politics represents all these other aspects. So But I mean, to your point, I'm also careful about how I say it, and I can always use Maslow's hierarchy of needs if it says the same thing, but in a secular way.
Are there other questions?
Thanks, Aaron. I had a question. So I hear you challenging us, maybe more in the technical side of things to get in touch with that the right side there. And so I'm curious, what advice do you have for us for ways to do that, to dip our feet into it, to bring it into our work, to have it be more central to, or be thinking about it as part of what we're doing. You mentioned just a few things that struck me in terms of like, yeah, oh, that'd be really uncomfortable for me to do that. But I think I hear the importance of it. So
Yeah.
how do we, you've obviously evolved in this space and live in this space now. How do we start to do that?
Well, first of all, you got to wait till you get tenure. So let me ask you, because you're picturing scenarios in your mind and you're asking about. So what's the scenario and what would be hard?
I think, I think about like, well, and I think you said it eloquently a few times, like, I think the fear of offending, and
Yeah.
I think the fear of, my lived experience or my approach to it not resonating with someone else. So like, how do you make the space for it in the conversations? And I think make explicit that it is an important thing to bring, because I think our tendency is to say, try to wall it in with the things that are technical, to like exclude politics, exclude the religion, exclude these other things. Just approaches for both to develop a comfort in having it be part of the conversation, and then strategies to bring it into those conversations.
That's a great question. I can only speak from my own experiences that, and as a facilitator, I mean, I'm really comfortable when there are different narratives at the same table. I mean, that's my world, right? And so just recognizing that and practicing that, and I think, this idea of making people feel uncomfortable, one of the things that we practice when we're in facilitation. Well, we have time, right? Yeah, all right, let's do a quick exercise. So pair up with let's start. What are the most difficult issues facing humanity today? The most contentious issues. Dorothy. Climate change. What else? Oh, come on, that's all you got? What? Food security, guns, Palestine, abortion, right? Any of those. Okay. Say again? Democracy is contentious? Shouldn't be. Okay, fair. All right. Pair up with somebody. Now, first of all, just sit for a second and pick any one of those contentious issues, right? And picture having a really, really difficult conversation around it, right? Picture the very first moments you start to talk to somebody who has a very, very different view than you, okay? Just sit with that for a second. What starts to happen? What do you feel?
I feel defensive.
Defensive, how does it feel in your body? Starting to tighten up, right? Tighten up, yep. What else? Confusion, like what the hell, right? I'm right, what are they talking about? In your body, what does it feel like? Sorry? Helpless, right? So that physical tension, it has a name, right? What is it? Your heart's palpitating, your eyes are dilating, what's that called? It's anxiety, it's fight or flight, right? So that's your amygdala. It's called an amygdala capture, right? So your amygdala is taking control. It's always kind of scanning. What are you doing? What are you doing? And if it feels any kind of danger, it takes over all your system. Takes your adrenal system, takes your muscular system, takes your nervous system, just captures everything and says, get ready to fight or to run, right? How many people actually felt some of that just thinking about it? right? So think about how powerful that is. You're in a beautiful room with nice people. There's coffee right outside, restrooms. It's not cold. It's not hot. You know you're in a safe place. You know this scenario is just in your head, and your amygdala thinks somebody's trying to kill you. Right? So that's how powerful it is. So come back to the question, how do you deal with this? One of the things that traditions teach you to do is to see that as a signal, and instead what we do if we don't think about it is we get defensive and we start to push back. We start to scream, we start to get upset, and then you're screaming at each other, okay? Who asked the original question? Yeah, so this is how. Does anybody in here feel uncomfortable? Where was everybody's amygdala during this exercise? Right? So the way your body reacts, it comes from faith traditions. The way your body reacts to a situation depends on your intention going into the situation. If your intention is defensive, fear, you want to persuade, when people say, I want to understand, no, that's bullshit. You want to persuade somebody, right? If you're going in to do that, your amygdala is going to be defensive. If you're going in looking for commonality, looking for understanding, looking for connection, looking for relationship, your amygdala is like, go ahead. I'm good. And look at how easy it was, right? The most contentious issues of the day, couple of things in common, boom, within 3 minutes, right? Because we're so structured to be thinking about the differences and the positions, and this is the faith tradition teaching us, aspire to the common values, aspire to where we can meet, right? And if you think about any of these issues, probably 80% we actually do agree on. I think you guys, who talked about climate change and said whether it's happening or not? I think that ship sailed. I think people agree that it's happening. Either it's human induced or it's not. That's the debate, right? And so if that's the case, you can agree on adaptation, right? Doesn't matter. You're from Houston, right? How's Houston right now, right? Exactly, right? It's like climate, right? Whether people are responsible or not, fix frickin' the drainage in Houston, right? That's kind of important. Same with Israel-Palestine. If you ask most Israelis and Palestinians, everybody wants peace. Everybody wants security. Everybody wants stability, right? Same with guns. What's the higher level? I feel so unsafe, I want more guns around me. I feel so unsafe, I want fewer guns around me. Let's start the conversation around safety. What does it feel like? What does it mean to feel safe? And then you back into the differences, right? So all of this comes from faith traditions. And I could point to why thinking about your amygdala is a Buddhist meditation practice, why aspiring to a higher value comes from Christian concepts of grace. I can talk explicitly about where all this comes from, but you don't have to, right? You have the conversation without necessarily naming what the sources are. Fair? Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity.
Let's thank Aaron for the talk. Thank you.